When I talk about weak account management, it's not just one thing. There are multiple different ways of standing up account management facilities that demonstrate various weaknesses. Now, often these are just little nuances that aren't really considered to be a security risk when they're designed, but when you look at them in the right light, you realize that they can indeed be used in very malicious ways. So let's go and take a look at some of those ways now. This time, I want to start by looking at different ways that you can have weak account management. So one really obvious way is poor password rules. If you allow people to create very short passwords, let's say that may just be all numbers, that's going to create a whole bunch of different problems because people will often adhere to the absolute minimum criteria. Now, one of those problems is brute force attacks, which also brings into question how is an application defending against brute force attacks? So for example, what if an attacker has a script that keeps trying to log into someone's account with different passwords? Perhaps it tries the 100 most common passwords that people use. How will the app behave? Will it allow the attacker to just keep trying over and over and over again? Another aspect of account management which is often weak is the Remember Me feature. So that little checkbox you see when you log in, which allows you to stay logged into the website for long periods of time. I've seen many cases where this feature has done things like stored the actual username and password in a cookie in the user's browser. Now that's a really risky way of storing sensitive information, and certainly there are much more secure ways of building this feature. Another example is a vulnerable password change feature. So for example, a page that allows you to change the password to something new, but never have to provide the existing password. That not only puts the user at risk of someone else possibly sitting down at their PC and changing their password, but it also puts them at risk of attacks like cross-site request forgery, where an attacker could trick the user's browser into changing the password on their behalf, changing it to one that the attacker has already predetermined. Not having to provide the existing password before doing that introduces this problem. And while we're talking about passwords, having an enumerable password reset function. Now this has actually been a topical issue in recent times, and I'm going to give you a real-world example of that in a moment. But let's begin by talking through the mechanics of how an enumerable password reset function actually works. This is going to be a very simple diagram, and it should make sense immediately when you see how it works. So let's imagine we have an attacker, and of course we have our web server, we have an application running on it, and the attacker asks the web server if an account exists on it. So does a user have an account on that system? And then the web server tells them yes or no. It is that simple. And the question to ask is whether or not this should be possible. So should an attacker be able to easily discover whether someone's email address exists on that system? Here's the topical example I mentioned. During 2015, we had two really serious attacks against sites that had some pretty sensitive data in them. One was the Adult Friend Finder site, the other was Ashley Madison. Both sites designed to help people have affairs. Their privacy on those sites is clearly absolutely paramount to them. They would not want other people discovering they had accounts. Yet in both cases, both those sites, before they were hacked and data was exposed, had an account enumeration risk. And what that meant was that anybody, attackers, jealous spouses, the general public, could go to one of those sites and simply ask it if a person had an account. Let's jump over to our vulnerable app and I'll show you exactly how that works. Here's a fairly typical looking password reset page. Enter an email address and then simply reset. Let's have a look at how this works, and this will probably be a very familiar pattern to you. I'm going to enter an email address and then submit the form. And here we see a message, password reset emailed. Okay, that's a fairly typical outcome. Let's now go back and try a different email address. So this time, here's what I'm going to do. Let's try and reset Mary's password. Now we get a very different message. And again, this is probably a familiar pattern to you. It's not that unusual at all. But have a think about what's just happened. The system has told us that John has an account. It's then told us that Mary does not have an account. Now for John, it was implicit. Mary, it's pretty clear. She obviously has no account on that system. So the mechanics of this are actually very simple, and it's something that just about anybody can do on just about any system. It does, however, beg the question of how much of a risk is this? So for example, on a snowboard site like this, would John really be upset that anybody can go and discover that he has an account? Possibly not. But imagine that John had an account on a website that was much more sensitive. Let's imagine it was Adult Friend Finder or Ashley Madison. Would John then be upset that both those sites were disclosing his presence? Well, quite possibly yes. He probably would have expected to have privacy on those sites. So this is another common theme within security, applying the right controls to the right places. Now, many people will argue that you should have privacy on every site, even if it is just a snowboard site. It shouldn't disclose the presence of the account. But certainly there are different degrees of impact, and you could quite reasonably argue that a site like this is much less likely to adversely impact customers, if this risk exists, than some other classes of website. So let's go and talk about how to defend against this risk. There are a few different things we can do to mitigate this risk of account enumeration. And the first one is to simply always respond in an identical fashion. So in that web app, we would need to see the same response. And a good response is something like, an email has been sent to you. Now, of course, if someone has an email on the system, then the email that they receive can simply begin the password reset process. If they don't have an account, then the email can explain that. Hey, you just did a password reset, but you don't actually have an account on this site. Perhaps you created it under a different email address. Or if you didn't have an account at all, you might like to register. That mechanism uses email as the verification channel of the account's existence. And of course, the recipient of the email has every right to know whether they have an account on the system. But it keeps it away from the public, so that someone who's got absolutely nothing to do with that account can't simply go through and enumerate them. Now, password reset is only one vector, so consider other vectors as well. And of course, when I talk about vector, I'm talking about the way that this risk can be exploited. So something like the login. Some systems will explicitly say, hey, that username that you tried to log in with doesn't exist. Clearly, a better response would be to say that the username and password combination is incorrect. Registration is another common risk because a registration system likes to make sure that there's nobody already in the system with the same email address. Of course, the solution to handling registration is the same as the solution for handling password resets. You have to give the same response in the web application and then take the direct communication with the individual off the website and into email. And finally, and I did touch on this several times, this is really a contextual risk. The snowboard example is a very different risk profile to the adult website example, and there are a whole bunch of shades of grey in between. For example, a bank. Should you be able to discover if an individual has an account on a particular banking website? Well, it's financial data. That can be quite sensitive. That can be the sort of information which is then used in a phishing attack. Think about the impact on an organization as well. So how might a risk like this actually extend beyond just the website itself and begin impacting the corporate environment? Well, a really good example would be for an attacker to use the information that they can discover via enumeration risks in a spear phishing attack. So what if the attacker went around to a number of common websites, checked if the person had an account on them, and then sent them a very specifically targeted email that represented the fact the attacker knows they have an account on that site. Spearphishing attacks are often very successful because they're so well crafted. They contain information about the individual. So that's a number of different weak account management practices we've now looked at. And we've especially spent time looking at this account enumeration risk. That wraps up the 5 main risks I wanted to look at in this video. Let's now go and we'll wrap the whole thing up with a summary.